In the dying light of the old Republic, when the galaxy still believed in heroes, a woman stood at the precipice of damnation. Her name was Sorzus, and she would become something far more terrible than the Jedi who cast her out could have ever imagined. They say she gazed into the abyss of forbidden knowledge and smiled, that she touched life itself and twisted it into shapes that made the Force itself recoil, that her hands, once raised in meditation as a Jedi scholar, became stained with experiments so dark that even whispers of them were forbidden for 6,000 years. But before the monster, before the legend, before the red sands of Korriban drank deep of her ambition, there was a choice. A single moment when she could have turned back, when the Jedi Council stood before her, offering mercy if only she would renounce her research. And in that moment, with the weight of everything she could become hanging in the balance, she spoke 3 words that would echo through millennia. Knowledge is power. What followed was a war that nearly shattered the Republic, an exile that became a coronation, a species enslaved, an empire born in darkness, and at the center of it all, one woman's relentless pursuit of a secret that would make her immortal, not through life, but through legacy. Tonight we journey into the forbidden chronicles of the woman who transformed from a Jedi scholar into the mother of Sith alchemy, the architect of abominations, the author of the most dangerous text in galactic history. Before we dive deep into this ancient tale, I need to share something. Around 62% of you listening right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars legends, subscribing truly helps this channel grow and lets me bring you more forgotten stories like this one. So take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe if these tales speak to you. Drop a comment letting me know where in the galaxy you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Whether you're in New York at midnight or Sydney at dawn, I love knowing this community spans the entire world. Now settle in, dim those lights, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Tonight we walk the path of Sorzus, from the gleaming halls of the Jedi Temple to the blood-red tombs of Korriban. Let's begin. 7,000 years before the rise of the Empire, before Darth Bane reformed the Sith, before even the tales that became legends, the old Republic stood at the height of its power. The Jedi Order numbered in the thousands, guardians of peace spread across 100,000 worlds. Their temple on Coruscant rose like a mountain of light above the endless city, and within its halls, the greatest minds in the galaxy studied the mysteries of the Force. Among them was a woman named Sorzus. She was not remarkable to look at, not at first. Average height, with the lean build of someone who spent more time in libraries than training halls, but her eyes held something that made even the oldest masters pause, an intensity, a hunger, the kind of brilliance that either enlightens the galaxy or sets it ablaze. Sorzus had been a model Jedi in her youth. Disciplined, studious, her instructors praised her analytical mind, her ability to see patterns others missed. She absorbed knowledge like desert sand drinks water, always thirsting for more. Philosophy, history, the technical applications of the Force, she mastered them all. But there was one field that called to her, above all others, one area where her fascination crossed into obsession. Life itself. She wanted to understand it completely, to know how the Force animated flesh and bone, to comprehend the boundary between living and dying, and perhaps to manipulate that boundary, to extend life, to defeat death, to master the ultimate mystery. The Jedi archives contained much, but not enough. Never enough. Ancient texts hinted at techniques the Order had deliberately forgotten. References to Force users who had pushed beyond natural limits, who had reshaped living tissue through sheer will and dark side power. The Jedi called it forbidden, dangerous, corruption. Sorzus called it incomplete research. She began to seek out the texts the archivists kept locked away. Late at night, she would slip through restricted sections, reading by the glow of her datapad what the Council deemed too dangerous for most Jedi eyes: Sith holocrons. Accounts of ancient Force wielders who had performed miracles and atrocities in equal measure. Experiments in alchemy that blended the Force with living flesh. And the more she read, the more she understood a terrible truth. The Jedi were not guardians of knowledge, they were its jailers. They hoarded wisdom out of fear. They restricted understanding out of weakness. They called their ignorance virtue and their cowardice caution. All the secrets of life and death, all the power to reshape reality itself, locked away because they were too afraid to wield it. Sorzus would not be afraid. She gathered others who felt as she did, brilliant minds frustrated by Jedi restrictions. Together they would push beyond the boundaries the Order had drawn. Together they would discover what the Force could truly accomplish when wielded without fear. Together they would become something the galaxy had not seen in 1,000 years. They would become Dark Jedi, and the Republic would burn. The schism did not happen overnight. Revolutions rarely do. It began in quiet conversations in shadowed corners of the temple, whispered debates about the true nature of the Force, questions that made the Council uncomfortable. If the Force flows through all life, why should Jedi fear to manipulate that life? If knowledge exists, why seal it away? If power can be mastered, why call mastery corruption? Sorzus found others who shared her frustrations. Brilliant minds like Ajunta Paul, a duelist whose skill was matched only by his ambition. Remulus Draper, who believed the Force demanded dominance, not servitude. Karnas Moore, who saw sentient beings as clay to be molded. Thargzan, whose vision spoke of empires yet unborn. They met in secret at first, sharing forbidden texts, discussing theories the Council would have condemned. But discussion inevitably led to experimentation. Sorzus established a hidden laboratory on a remote moon. There, far from the prying eyes of Jedi Masters, she began her first true work. She studied how the Force moved through living cells, how it could be bent to accelerate growth, enhance strength, even reshape flesh entirely. Her early subjects were simple creatures, insects, small mammals. Nothing the Jedi would have mourned. But each success pushed her further. She discovered she could take a harmless creature and transform it into something powerful, something dangerous. The dark side of the Force flowed through her fingers as she worked, and she welcomed it. There was no corruption in knowledge, no evil in understanding, only results. When the Council finally discovered what she and her followers had been doing, their reaction was everything Sorzus expected. Horror, condemnation, immediate demands that the research stop, that all specimens be destroyed, that she repent and return to proper Jedi teachings. She refused. The Council gave her one final chance: stand trial, renounce her work, accept punishment and guidance, return to the light. Instead, Sorzus gathered her allies and declared that the Jedi Order had lost its way, that they had become guardians of ignorance rather than wisdom, that true understanding of the Force required embracing all of its aspects, not just the parts that felt comfortable. The Council's response was exile. But Sorzus and her followers chose war. The conflict that followed would last 100 years and nearly destroy the Republic. History would call it the 100-Year Darkness, and it would be remembered as the first great schism within the Jedi Order. The opening battles caught the Republic unprepared. Dark Jedi struck at Jedi outposts across the Outer Rim, their attacks coordinated and brutal. Sorzus commanded forces augmented by her alchemical creations. Creatures that had once been animals now served as shock troops, their bodies twisted into forms designed for war. Some walked on legs that bent in wrong directions. Others had multiple heads or limbs ending in natural weapons she had coaxed from their genetic code. The Jedi who faced these abominations in battle were horrified. This was exactly what they had feared, proof that Sorzus and her kind had fallen beyond redemption. But to Sorzus, they were proof of concept, validation that her theories worked. If she could reshape simple beasts, what could she accomplish with more complex subjects, with willing volunteers from among her followers, with entire populations? The war spread. Worlds that had known peace for generations suddenly found themselves battlegrounds. The Dark Jedi established strongholds on remote planets, building fortresses and laboratories where they continued their experiments even as the fighting raged. Sorzus thrived in the chaos. War provided unlimited opportunities for research. Subjects who volunteered, hoping her enhancements would make them powerful enough to survive. Enemies captured in battle who became unwilling test subjects. And always, she documented everything, every success, every failure, every technique refined. She began to change during those years, not just philosophically, but physically. The dark side left its mark on those who used it without restraint. Her eyes, once bright with scholarly curiosity, took on a harder gleam. Her presence in the Force became something that made even her allies uncomfortable when she focused her full attention on them. But she was winning, not just battles, but the deeper war of proving her theories correct. She could reshape life. She could enhance it, strengthen it, mold it to her will. The Force was not some mystical energy to be respected and feared. It was a tool, and she had learned to wield it like no Jedi ever had. For decades, the conflict raged. The Republic threw its full military might behind the Jedi, but the Dark Jedi were not easily defeated. They had abandoned the Jedi Code's restrictions on emotion, on attachment, on the full use of their powers. They fought with a ferocity that caught the traditional Jedi off guard. Entire star systems changed hands. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire. The Republic's economy strained under the weight of endless war. And through it all, Sorzus continued her work, each year bringing new discoveries, new applications of Force alchemy. She created her first true masterpiece during the war's middle years, a creature she designed from the ground up, mixing genetic material from 3 different apex predators and infusing the result with dark side energy. When it emerged from her laboratory, it stood 3 meters tall, possessed intelligence approaching sentience, and could tear through durasteel with claws she had specifically engineered for that purpose. She called it beautiful. The Jedi called it an abomination. But names meant nothing compared to results, and the results spoke clearly. Sorzus Sin had mastered something the Jedi refused to even attempt. She had bent life itself to her will. Yet even as she achieved triumph after triumph in her laboratory, the larger war began to turn against the Dark Jedi. The Republic's resources were simply too vast. The Jedi, for all their restrictions and fear, still outnumbered the Dark Jedi 10 to 1, and they were learning. Learning to fight without restraint when necessary. Learning to counter the alchemical creatures Sorzus unleashed. Learning that sometimes the high ground was not enough, and victory required descending into the mud. The final phase of the war saw the Dark Jedi pushed back, system by system. Their strongholds fell. Their followers were captured or killed. The Republic was battered and exhausted, but it was winning. Sorzus felt the tide turning. She knew, with the same analytical clarity that had made her a brilliant scholar, that conventional victory was slipping away. The question became not whether they would lose, but what would come after. She spent the war's final months preparing, securing her most important research, copying her notes and storing them in multiple locations, creating redundancy so that even if she were captured or killed, her work would survive. Because that was what mattered. Not territory, not military victory, knowledge, understanding, the techniques she had developed, and the discoveries she had made. Those were immortal. Even as Republic forces closed in on the last Dark Jedi strongholds, even as her allies began to fall or surrender, Sorzus remained focused on her true purpose. She had learned how to reshape life. She had proven the Jedi wrong about the limits of what the Force could accomplish. And somehow, some way, that knowledge would endure. The final battle came on a world called Korbos, the last major Dark Jedi force, cornered and outnumbered. A desperate fight that lasted 3 days and left the planet's surface scarred for generations. When the dust settled, the Jedi had won. And Sorzus Sin, along with the surviving Dark Jedi leaders, stood in chains before those who had once been their peers. The 100-year darkness was over. But for Sorzus, the true journey was only beginning. The chains were lighter than she expected. Some exotic alloy designed to resist force manipulation. They hung from her wrists and ankles as she stood in the Jedi Council chamber, surrounded by masters whose faces showed equal parts relief and revulsion. Relief that the war was finally over. Revulsion at what she had become. Ajunta Pal stood beside her, defiant even in defeat. Further down the line, she could see Remulus Draipar, Karnas Moore, Zoazan, and dozens of other Dark Jedi who had survived the final battle. The youngest among them looked terrified. The oldest wore expressions of cold calculation, already planning whatever came next. Sorzus felt neither fear nor defeat. She felt curiosity about what the Council would do. Would they execute their former brothers and sisters, imprison them, attempt some kind of forced redemption? The answer, when it came, was worse than any of those options. Exile. Not just expulsion from the Order, but banishment from the Republic itself. Every captured Dark Jedi would be loaded onto ships and sent into the unknown regions, that vast unexplored darkness beyond the galactic rim, sent away with enough supplies to survive, but forbidden from ever returning. The Jedi could not bring themselves to execute their former allies, but neither could they risk keeping them anywhere near civilized space, so they would send them into the void and let the galaxy forget they had ever existed. The Sorzus listened to the sentence and felt something unexpected, not anger, but liberation. They were setting her free, free from the Republic's laws, free from the Jedi's restrictions, free to pursue her research wherever she ended up without anyone to stop her. The fools thought they were punishing her. They had no idea they were giving her exactly what she needed. The trial lasted only a day. The sentence was carried out within a week. Sorzus found herself aboard a battered Republic transport that had seen better decades. The ship was barely spaceworthy, its hyperdrive held together with improvised repairs and desperate hope, but it would serve. It had to. Nearly 200 Dark Jedi were crammed into vessels that should have carried half that number. Minimal supplies, no navigation charts beyond the edge of known space, just coordinates pointing outward, and a one-way ticket into darkness. As the ships broke orbit and the Jedi escorts turned back toward the Republic, Sorzus stood at a viewport and watched the galaxy she knew fade behind her. Coruscant became a distant spark, then nothing. For the first time in 100 years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened. Everything she had known was gone. The archives she had studied in as a young Jedi, the laboratories she had built during the war, her network of followers and subjects, all of it left behind. But her mind remained, her knowledge remained, and that was enough. The journey into the unknown regions was harder than anyone anticipated. Without proper charts, they jumped blind, hoping each hyperspace calculation would not send them into a star or black hole. Ships broke down. Supplies ran lower than planned. Arguments broke out about where to go, what to do, whether to try returning to the Republic despite the exile. Sorzus spent most of the journey in her cramped quarters, reviewing what research materials she had managed to bring. Notes copied onto datapads, a few physical specimens preserved in stasis, genetic samples from her most successful creations. Not much, but enough to continue her work once they found somewhere to land. If they found somewhere to land, the weeks turned into months. The Dark Jedi were not accustomed to deprivation. They were scholars, warriors, leaders, not refugees fleeing into the void. Tempers flared. Some ships separated from the fleet, their crews choosing to take their chances alone rather than continue this aimless wandering. But Sorzus began to experience something strange. Visions during meditation, dreams when she slept, images of red sand beneath an alien sky, ancient structures built by hands unknown, and power, raw dark side power, radiating from a world she had never seen but somehow recognized. She was not alone in these visions. Other Dark Jedi reported similar dreams, a calling, a pull towards something waiting for them in the darkness. Ajunta Pal, who had emerged as the unofficial leader of the exiles, made the decision to follow the visions. They had nothing else to guide them, no better plan. Just this strange certainty that the Force itself was leading them somewhere. The ships turned toward the pull they all felt. More weeks passed. More ships broke down or split off. The fleet that had started with nearly a dozen vessels dwindled to 5, then 4. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Water recyclers strained past their limits. The Dark Jedi, who had once commanded armies, now lived like prisoners in their own ships. But the visions grew stronger. Sorzus could see it now, even when awake. A red world orbiting a yellow sun, valleys filled with ancient tombs, temples carved from stone that predated anything in Republic records, and something else. Something alive, not quite sentient, but aware, waiting for them. Then, after nearly 6 months of blind wandering through unmapped space, the sensors detected something. A star system, terrestrial planets, breathable atmospheres. The ships emerged from hyperspace above a world that matched the visions exactly. Red sand covering continents, minimal vegetation, ancient structures visible even from orbit, and the dark side so strong it made the ship's hull vibrate with its presence. Sorzus stood at the viewport, her hands pressed against the transperistyle, and felt tears on her face for the first time in years. Not tears of sadness, tears of recognition. This was home, not the home she had left behind, but the home she was meant to find, the place where her true work would begin. Ajunta Pal gave the order. All ships to begin landing procedures. The battered transports descended through the planet's atmosphere, their hulls screaming from the stress. Warning alarms blared, systems failed, but they made it down. One after another, the ships landed in a vast valley surrounded by massive stone structures. As the landing ramps lowered and Sorzus took her first steps onto red sand, she felt the dark side rush through her like a living thing, welcoming her, claiming her. She knelt and let the sand run through her fingers. It was warm, gritty, real. Around her, nearly 100 Dark Jedi stared at the alien landscape with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. They had survived exile, survived the journey, but what now? Sorzus stood and looked toward the ancient structures rising from the desert. Her analytical mind was already racing. Who had built them? How long ago? What knowledge might they contain? Then she saw movement in the distance. Figures emerging from the ruins, humanoid, but not human. Red skin, facial tentacles, eyes that glowed with force sensitivity. The Dark Jedi were not alone on this world, and everything was about to change. The red-skinned beings approached slowly, and Sorzus counted at least 50 in the first group. More appeared from various ruins, drawn by the arrival of the ships. They wore primitive clothing, leather and rough cloth, but they carried themselves with purpose. These were not simple savages. As they drew closer, Sorzus could feel their connection to the Force, raw, untrained, but powerful. These beings were naturally sensitive to the dark side in a way she had never encountered. It radiated from them like heat from a forge. The leader of the group stopped 10 meters from where Ajuntapal stood. He was tall for his species, his red skin marked with ritual scars, his facial tentacles adorned with bone rings. When he spoke, his language was completely alien, but his intent was clear from his posture. He was bowing. They all were. The entire group of red-skinned beings had dropped to their knees in the sand, foreheads pressed to the ground, prostrating themselves before the newcomers. One of the younger Dark Jedi laughed nervously. Another whispered a question about what was happening. But Sorzus understood immediately. These beings had been waiting. The ancient structures around them were temples, sacred places, and the visions that had drawn the Dark Jedi here had not come from nowhere. This world, whatever it was called, had been calling to Force users for longer than anyone knew. To these red-skinned people, the Dark Jedi were not refugees. They were gods. Ajuntapal stepped forward, his presence in the Force expanding to fill the valley. He raised his hand and several large stones lifted from the ground, hovering in the air around him. A simple demonstration, a clear message. The prostrate beings trembled. Some began chanting in their alien language, words Sorzus did not understand but could feel the meaning of through the Force: worship, reverence, submission. One of the Dark Jedi, a woman named Sendance, moved through the group of kneeling beings and gently touched the leader's shoulder. He looked up at her with eyes full of awe. She smiled and helped him to his feet, then gestured for the others to rise. Over the following days, a basic communication developed. The beings called themselves the Sith. Their world was Korriban, and the massive valley where the ships had landed was sacred ground, the Valley of the Golg, though later explorers would rename it the Valley of the Dark Lords. The Sith people had been waiting for generations. Their prophecies spoke of powerful beings who would descend from the sky and lead them to greatness. Every aspect of their culture was built around Force sensitivity. Their leaders were shamans who wielded dark side powers. Their warriors were trained to channel rage and passion in battle. Their entire society was a pyramid with the strongest at the top. It was perfect. Within weeks, the Dark Jedi had established complete control. They did not need to conquer through violence. The Sith species offered their submission willingly, eagerly. They brought food, supplies, slaves from conquered tribes. They opened their temples and sacred places to the newcomers, revealing chambers that had been sealed for centuries. Ajuntapal was crowned the first Dark Lord of the Sith in a ceremony that drew thousands of the red-skinned people. He stood atop an ancient pyramid while Sith shamans performed rituals that made the dark side itself seem to pulse with approval. The other surviving Dark Jedi were given territories to rule. Remulus Drapar claimed the southern wastes. Karnus Mur took the ancient fortress complexes in the eastern mountains. Soagzan established herself in the burial grounds where the most powerful Sith shamans had been entombed. Sorzus chose the Temple District, a sprawling complex of interconnected structures that had stood for longer than the Sith themselves could remember. Some buildings were clearly recent, crude constructions built atop far older foundations, but others were ancient beyond measure, their architecture speaking of knowledge and power that had existed on this world long before the current Sith civilization. The first time Sorzus descended into the lower levels of her chosen temple, she knew she had found something extraordinary. The chambers beneath were pristine, preserved by some technique that had kept air fresh and darkness at bay for millennia. and everywhere carved into walls and pillars, written on preserved scrolls and etched into crystal tablets, was knowledge. Alchemical formulas, genetic manipulation techniques, instructions for reshaping flesh through the Force, everything she had been researching during the war, these ancient builders had already mastered, and they had left their secrets here, waiting for someone worthy to find them. Sorzus spent weeks exploring, her excitement building with each new discovery. The ancient Sith, whoever they had been, had achieved things that made her own experiments look primitive. They had created entirely new species. They had extended lifespans by centuries. They had learned to bind the Force into physical objects, creating what the texts called amulets and talismans of terrible power. She claimed the entire complex as her domain. Sith slaves cleared out chambers that would become laboratories. Others were trained as assistants, their natural Force sensitivity making them surprisingly capable once shown what to do. The brightest among them she kept close, teaching them basic techniques while learning their language. Within months, she had established the most sophisticated research facility she had ever possessed. Better than anything during the war. Better than anything that had existed in the Republic. Here, on this red desert world, she finally had everything she needed. Unlimited subjects willing to volunteer for enhancement. Ancient texts explaining techniques she would have spent decades discovering on her own. Raw materials native to Korriban that were naturally infused with dark side energy and time. Blessed, uninterrupted time to work without Jedi interference or war distractions. Her first major experiment was enhancing a volunteer Sith warrior. She studied the ancient texts, adapted their techniques to her own understanding, and carefully reshaped his genetic structure, strengthening bone density, enhancing muscle fiber, accelerating healing, deepening his connection to the Force. When he emerged from the alchemical pod 3 weeks later, he stood half a meter taller. His natural red skin had darkened to crimson, his strength had tripled, and his Force abilities, once barely enough to move small objects, now allowed him to crush stone with his mind. He knelt before Sorzus and called her master, the first of many. Word spread through the Sith population about the miracles being performed in the Temple District. Warriors came seeking enhancement. The sick came hoping for healing. The ambitious came wanting power, and Sorzus welcomed them all. Each subject taught her something new. The Sith species responded to alchemical manipulation differently than the creatures she had worked with during the war. Their natural Force sensitivity meant changes took hold faster, went deeper. She could reshape them in ways that would have killed any normal being. She began keeping detailed records, every experiment documented, every result analyzed, every technique refined. The ancient texts had given her the foundation, but she was building something new on top of it. A synthesis of everything she had learned as a Jedi scholar, everything she had discovered during the war, and everything these ruins were teaching her. Other dark Jedi came to observe her work. Some were horrified, others fascinated. A few asked to learn her techniques. She accepted the most promising as students, teaching them the basics of Sith alchemy while keeping her most advanced methods secret. The political structure of their new empire was forming. A junta Pal ruled as Dark Lord, but each of the other exiles had become lords in their own right, governing their territories with absolute authority. They began calling themselves Sith Lords, adopting the name of the species they ruled. It felt right. They were no longer Dark Jedi. That identity belonged to the Republic, to the war they had lost. Here, on Korriban, they were something new, something that would endure for thousands of years. They were Sith, and Sorzus Sin, standing in her laboratory, surrounded by the tools of her trade, looking out over a red desert that stretched to the horizon, smiled. Her true work had finally begun. The years that followed were consumed by discovery. Sorzus descended into the depths of her temple complex with the fervor of a woman possessed, and perhaps she was possessed by curiosity, by ambition, by the intoxicating realization that she stood on the edge of understanding mysteries the galaxy had forgotten existed. The lower chambers revealed themselves slowly, like a flower opening to darkness instead of light. Each sealed door she opened led to another hall of wonders, libraries containing thousands of scrolls written in the ancient Sith language, a tongue so different from what the current inhabitants spoke that it might as well have been from another galaxy entirely. But Sorzus had always excelled at languages, and the Force itself seemed to whisper translations as she studied the archaic characters. What she found in those texts rewrote everything she thought she knew about the limits of biological manipulation. The ancient Sith practitioners, whoever they had been, had not simply enhanced life, they had created it. Entire species designed from conception to serve specific purposes. Predators engineered to hunt with supernatural efficiency. Guardians that could stand watch for decades without rest. Even companions, creatures whose sole evolutionary purpose was providing comfort and loyalty to their masters. The techniques were elegant in their brutality. Where Sorzus had been forcing changes onto existing genetic structures, these ancient masters had worked from the cellular level upward. They understood how to make the dark side a fundamental part of an organism's biology, weaving Force sensitivity into DNA itself. She began experimenting immediately. Her laboratory expanded to fill an entire wing of the temple, chamber after chamber converted to specific purposes. One room for genetic sampling, another for alchemical preparation, a third for the actual transformation process, a fourth for recovery and observation, each space meticulously organized, every tool precisely placed. Sith volunteers still came, drawn by promises of power and the undeniable evidence of her success. But Sorzus was no longer content with simple enhancement. She wanted to push further, to see how far flesh could be reshaped before it stopped being flesh and became something else entirely. Her first true masterwork took 3 months to complete. She started with a Sith warrior of average build and unremarkable Force sensitivity. Through careful application of alchemical processes learned from the ancient texts and refined by her own understanding, she systematically rebuilt him. His skeletal structure was reinforced with compounds that made his bones nearly unbreakable. His muscular system was rewoven to provide triple the normal strength without increasing size. His nervous system was enhanced to process information faster, making his reflexes approach precognition. But the most significant change was in his connection to the Force itself. Sorzus had learned how to deepen that connection, to make it as fundamental to his being as breathing. When he emerged from the final treatment, he could move objects with his mind that would have required a Jedi Master's concentration. He could sense emotions from across the valley. He could even, with effort, influence the thoughts of those weaker in the Force than himself. She called him her first true success. He called her his goddess and swore eternal service. Word of this achievement spread through the growing Sith Empire like wildfire. Suddenly, every ambitious Sith Lord wanted specimens created by Sorzus Sinon, warriors for their armies, guardians for their fortresses, even personal attendants, enhanced to provide better service. She accepted some commissions, refused others. Her criteria were simple but absolute. She would only work on projects that advanced her understanding. Routine enhancements held no interest, but novel applications, unique challenges, experiments that pushed into unexplored territory, those she embraced with enthusiasm. A Sith Lord named Huckagram Grouse commissioned her to create guardian beasts for his palace. Instead of simply making existing creatures larger and stronger, Sorzus designed something new. She took genetic material from 3 apex predators native to Korriban, isolated the traits that made each one formidable, and wove them together into a single hybrid form. The resulting creature stood taller than a human, possessed 6 legs for stability and speed, had armored hide that could deflect blaster bolts, and demonstrated pack-hunting intelligence that made them terrifyingly effective. More importantly, they were sterile, unable to reproduce, completely dependent on alchemical creation for their continued existence. This became her standard practice. Every creation designed to be unique, unreproducible without her specific knowledge and techniques. It ensured her services remained valuable, but more importantly, it meant her work could not be replicated by lesser minds. The philosophical implications of what she was doing did not escape her notice. She was playing the role that nature itself had always played, selecting traits, determining which forms of life deserved to exist, shaping evolution according to her will rather than random chance. The old Jedi Sorzus would have been horrified. That woman had believed all life was sacred, that the Force flowed through every living thing with equal value. But that woman was dead, her ashes scattered across 100 battlefields during the war. This Sorzus understood a deeper truth. Life was not sacred, it was malleable, and in the hands of someone with sufficient knowledge and will, it could be sculpted into forms that served purposes far greater than mere survival. Her studies of the ancient texts revealed techniques she had never imagined possible, methods for preserving consciousness beyond physical death, though the instructions were incomplete and the few attempts she made ended in failure. Formulas for creating temporary life from non-living matter, though the results never lasted more than hours. Even hints at techniques for transferring the essence of one being into another body, a form of immortality that tantalized her with its possibilities. She documented everything. Every experiment, whether successful or failed, was recorded in meticulous detail. Her notes filled dozens of bound volumes, written in a combination of the ancient Sith language and her own coded shorthand. She included diagrams showing the progression of transformations, chemical formulas for the alchemical compounds she developed, instructions precise enough that someone with her level of skill could theoretically reproduce her work. Theoretically. In practice, Sith alchemy required more than following instructions. It demanded an intimate understanding of how the dark side interacted with living tissue, a feel for the process that could only be gained through years of practice, and a willingness to embrace aspects of the Force that most beings instinctively recoiled from. Her relationship with other Sith Lords grew complex during these years. Some viewed her with genuine respect, recognizing her genius and the value of her contributions to their empire. Others saw her as a useful tool, a means to an end who should be controlled and directed. A few considered her dangerous, her power too independent, her knowledge too vast. Ajunta Pal remained her most consistent supporter. As the Dark Lord, his word carried absolute authority, and he made it clear that Sorzus was to be given freedom to pursue her research without interference. Whether this support came from recognition of her value or simple fear of what she might do if threatened, she neither knew nor cared. Among her fellow scholars and Force users, she found more genuine connection. Long conversations with Saoxan about the nature of the dark side and its relationship to physical reality. Debates with Remulus Drapar about the ethics of their work, though ethics in the Sith Empire meant something very different than in the Republic. Even Karnus Muz sought her counsel occasionally, his own studies into Force manipulation complementing her biological focus. But her truest companionship came from her students. She had begun taking apprentices, carefully selected individuals who showed both the intellectual capability and Force sensitivity required for alchemical work. Most were hybrid Sith, the children of unions between the original Dark Jedi exiles and the native population. They possessed the best of both lineages, the pure Force sensitivity of their Sith heritage combined with the advanced knowledge and technique of their Dark Jedi parentage. Teaching them brought unexpected satisfaction. watching a student successfully complete their first enhancement, seeing their eyes light up when they grasped a difficult concept, the pride when one of them published a technique she had not explicitly taught, showing true innovation rather than mere imitation. This, she realized one evening while watching the sun set over Korobin's endless red dunes, was another form of immortality. Not the physical continuation of her own life, but the propagation of her knowledge through generations of students who would carry her techniques forward long after her death. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made her acutely aware of her own mortality. She was aging, slower than normal beings thanks to her own enhancements and deep connection to the Force, but aging nonetheless. And all her knowledge of biology, all her mastery of life's fundamental processes had yet to reveal the secret she most desired. How to stop death permanently. How to truly live forever. That mystery still eluded her. But she had time, decades, perhaps centuries if she was careful, and she had resources now that she could barely have imagined during her exile. An entire empire's worth of subjects, materials, and ancient knowledge. Somewhere in all that, the answer existed. She just had to find it. The Sith Empire was no longer a collection of refugees ruling over a primitive species. 2 generations had passed since the exile, and something entirely new had emerged on Korobin and the worlds beyond. A true civilization, built on foundations of power and knowledge rather than justice and democracy. Sorzus watched this transformation with the same analytical interest she brought to her alchemical work. Society itself was an organism, and the Sith Empire was evolving in fascinating ways. The pure bloodline Dark Jedi were aging or dying, their numbers dwindling, but their hybrid children flourished, combining the best traits of both parent species. These new Sith were something the galaxy had never seen. Red-skinned like their native ancestors, but with features that spoke of human heritage. Naturally Force-sensitive, but trained in techniques the Republic's Jedi would have condemned. Passionate and ambitious in ways that made the old Jedi seem like pale shadows. And they needed philosophy, structure, a framework to understand their place in the cosmos and their relationship to the Force. The Dark Lords gathered in council more frequently during these years, not to plan conquests or settle disputes, but to debate the fundamental questions of their new order. What did it mean to be Sith? How should they relate to the Force? What principles should guide their civilization? Sorzus attended these councils when her research allowed. Her contributions were primarily practical rather than mystical. She had little patience for abstract philosophical debates that produced no tangible results, but she recognized the importance of establishing shared beliefs, common ground that would hold their empire together. The conversations often stretched late into the night, illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across ancient stone walls. A Junta Pal would preside, but everyone was permitted to speak, democracy in its most basic form, though the weight given to each person's words depended entirely on their demonstrated power and wisdom. Bugzogzan argued that the Force was a tool to be mastered, no different than a blade or a ship. Those strong enough to wield it deserved to rule. Those too weak deserved servitude. The natural order of the universe. Remulus Draper countered that the Force was alive, a conscious entity that demanded certain behaviors from its wielders. To truly embrace it required surrendering to passion, allowing emotion to flow without restraint. Only through intensity could one touch true power. Carnus Moore saw the Force as neutral, responding to will and intention rather than morality. Dark and light were illusions, artificial constructs created by the Jedi to limit what their members might achieve. True mastery came from using every aspect of the Force without prejudice. Sorzus listened to these arguments with interest, but offered a different perspective when asked. To her, the Force was like any natural phenomenon. Gravity, magnetism, chemical reactions. It followed rules, patterns. laws that could be understood and exploited. The Jedi's mistake was treating it as sacred. The Sith's advantage was recognizing it as a resource. From these debates, something began to crystallize, not a formal code yet, but the foundations of one concepts that resonated with everyone present, ideas that felt true in a way that Jedi teachings never had. Passion over serenity, strength over weakness, power over helplessness, freedom over restriction. The Jedi preached peace and submission to the Force's will. The Sith would embrace conflict and impose their will upon the Force itself. Where the Jedi saw knowledge as something to be carefully controlled and restricted, the Sith would pursue it without limitation. Sorzus contributed her own additions to this emerging philosophy. Knowledge was power, yes, but only if applied. Theory without practice was worthless. Understanding without implementation achieved nothing. The Sith should be defined not by what they believed, but by what they accomplished. She established the first true academy for Sith sorcery during this period. Not a laboratory like her own facilities, but a school, a place where promising students could learn the theoretical foundations before moving on to practical application. The curriculum she developed was comprehensive. Students began with basic Force techniques, but always with an emphasis on domination rather than harmony. They learned to impose their will on the world around them, to take what they wanted rather than wait for it to be given, to see every living thing as either a tool or an obstacle. More advanced students studied alchemy, though Sorzus kept her most sophisticated techniques to herself. She taught enough to create competent practitioners, but held back the insights that separated true mastery from mere skill. Let them earn those secrets through their own experimentation and discovery. The best students became her personal apprentices, working directly in her laboratories and gaining access to knowledge she shared with no one else. These privileged few represented the future of Sith alchemy. They would carry her techniques forward, adapt them to new situations, and perhaps even surpass her given enough time. Teaching also forced her to articulate things she had always understood intuitively. Why certain alchemical processes worked, how the dark side interacted with genetic structures, the relationship between physical transformation and Force sensitivity. Explaining these concepts to students clarified her own understanding, revealing gaps in her knowledge that demanded further research. Her influence spread beyond just alchemy and philosophy. As one of the oldest surviving Dark Jedi and the recognized master of an entire field, her opinions carried weight in matters of governance and policy. When the Dark Lords debated how to structure their empire's hierarchy, she advocated for meritocracy. Let the strongest rule, but define strength broadly. Intelligence, creativity, and knowledge were forms of power just as valid as skill with a lightsaber. When discussions turned to how the Sith should relate to the wider galaxy, whether to hide their existence or announce it, she argued for patience. The Republic believed them all dead or vanished. Let that belief continue. Build their civilization in secret, growing stronger while their enemies remained ignorant. Strike only when victory was certain. Not everyone agreed with her positions, but they respected the logic behind them. Sorzus Sin did not speak often in council, but when she did, people listened. The libraries she established became repositories of dark knowledge unmatched anywhere in the galaxy. Texts from the ancient Sith, records of the Dark Jedi's experiments during the war, new discoveries made by current practitioners, all preserved, catalogued, and made available to those deemed worthy. She implemented a system where knowledge was earned rather than freely given. Students had to prove themselves at each level before gaining access to more advanced materials. It ensured that dangerous techniques did not fall into incompetent hands, while also creating a culture of ambition and achievement. The Sith Empire's capital on Korriban gradually transformed from a collection of occupied ruins into a proper city. Buildings rose in the valleys between ancient temples, blending new construction with preservation of historical sites. Markets appeared where Sith from different territories could trade goods and knowledge, training grounds where warriors honed their skills. All of it centered around the dark side nexus that made Korriban so powerful. Sorzus preferred the quieter temple districts to the bustling city center. Her laboratories required concentration, and the noise of civilization was a distraction. But she made regular appearances in public spaces, maintaining her visibility and allowing younger Sith to see that the legendary alchemist was real, not just a figure from stories. Those encounters were always interesting. Some approached with reverence, treating her like the living legend she had become. Others with barely concealed ambition, seeing her as a challenge to overcome. A few with genuine curiosity, asking questions that showed real thought and insight. She treated each according to their demonstrated merit. The reverent were dismissed, unless they had something substantive to offer. The ambitious were tested, and most found wanting. But the genuinely curious, those she engaged with enthusiasm, because curiosity was the trait she valued above all others. It was curiosity that had driven her from Jedi scholar to Dark Lord. Curiosity that fueled every experiment and discovery. Curiosity that would, she hoped, eventually unlock the final mystery. How to live forever. 50 years after the exile, Sorzus Sin stood at the absolute apex of her power. The laboratories sprawled across multiple temple complexes, each one dedicated to specific branches of alchemical research. The main facility focused on enhancement of sentient beings. A secondary complex dealt with the creation of guardian creatures. A third explored the boundaries between life and death, attempting to understand and manipulate the transition between states. Hundreds of Sith worked under her direction, assistants who prepared specimens and materials, students at various levels of training, fellow masters who specialized in particular techniques. Even slaves, though she had learned to treat them better than most Sith lords. A terrified subject produced inconsistent results. Better to offer incentives and create loyalty than rely on pure coercion. Her reputation had spread beyond Korriban, to every world the Sith Empire controlled. Zeustun's, the administrative capital, Relg, with its dark side caves. Bejaran, covered in Sith temples. Kar Delba, and its moon, Kar Shian. On each of these worlds, Sith lords sought her services or her knowledge. She could name her price for commissions, rare materials, access to unexplored ruins, ancient texts from private collections. Sometimes she demanded political favors, using her influence to ensure certain policies were implemented or blocked. The practical power of indispensability. But wealth and influence meant less to her than achievement, and her achievements during this period were extraordinary even by her own standards. She successfully created a hybrid species that combined traits from 4 different predators into a single stable form. Previous attempts at such complex genetic mixing had produced creatures that lived only days before their incompatible biology caused system failures. But she identified the key, a specific sequence in Sith DNA that allowed for unusual genetic flexibility. By incorporating that sequence into her hybrids, she achieved stability. The resulting creatures were magnificent, powerful enough to tear through durasteel, intelligent enough to follow complex commands, and absolutely loyal to whoever completed the final stage of their alchemical awakening. She created a dozen before deciding the experiment was complete. Each one went to a different Sith Lord, spreading her influence while demonstrating her unmatched skill. Her breakthrough in life extension came during this period as well. Not the immortality she ultimately sought, but something significant nonetheless. Through a combination of alchemical treatments and Force techniques, she developed a process that could extend a Force-sensitive being's lifespan by up to 50%. The catch was that the process had to begin relatively early before age-related damage accumulated too extensively, and it required periodic renewal, treatments every few years to maintain the effect. But for Sith who began the regimen in their prime, it meant potentially living 200 years instead of 130. She tested the technique on herself first. Naturally, the treatments were agonizing, her entire cellular structure being slowly reorganized over the course of months. But when the process completed, she could feel the difference. Her body was still aging, but the rate had slowed dramatically. Injuries healed faster. Illness barely touched her. She had bought herself time. Many Sith Lords requested the same treatment. She accepted only those who could offer something truly valuable in return. This was not a service to be distributed freely. Each treatment took months of her personal attention and resources that could be used for other research. Only the most powerful or useful received this gift. The political implications were significant. Sorzus had effectively created a tier of Sith Lords who would outlive their peers by generations. It shifted power dynamics across the Empire. Those who received the treatment formed an unofficial network, bound by their shared enhancement and the debt they owed to its creator. Ajunta Pal was among the first she treated as the Dark Lord and her consistent supporter. She owed him that much. But she made him wait, demonstrating that even his authority had limits when it came to her work. When she finally performed the procedure, she did it perfectly, ensuring he would lead the Empire for generations to come. Her students from this era went on to become legendary figures in their own right. Some established their own schools, spreading variations of her techniques to new generations. Others became personal alchemists to powerful Sith Lords, their services as valued as any military commander. A few turned to research, pushing into areas that even Sorzus had not fully explored. She felt genuine pride watching them succeed. It was a strange emotion for someone who had long ago abandoned most softer feelings. But seeing her knowledge multiply through her students, watching them build on her foundations, created a satisfaction that no personal achievement could match. The philosophical framework of the Sith had solidified by this point. What would eventually be refined into the Sith Code existed in proto-form, and Sorzus's contributions were woven throughout. The emphasis on power through knowledge, the rejection of artificial limitations, the belief that strength in all its forms determined one's place in the natural hierarchy. She sat on the Dark Council now, one of the highest positions in the Empire. Her voice shaped policy and determined priorities. When the Empire debated expanding to new worlds, she advocated for strategic selection, choose planets rich in dark side energy, or rare materials useful for alchemy, avoid overextension that would dilute their strength. When younger Sith Lords proposed attacking the Republic, seeking revenge for the exile, she was among the loudest voices urging patience. The Republic was vast, its military powerful, and the Jedi still numbered in the thousands. The Sith Empire, for all its growth, could not yet match that strength. Better to continue building, to grow stronger in secret, to ensure that when they finally revealed themselves, victory would be inevitable. Her private chambers in the temple complex reflected her status. Vast rooms filled with collected treasures, artifacts from across Sith space, specimens preserved in stasis, representing pivotal moments in her research, and books, thousands of volumes, some ancient beyond measure, others her own writings documenting 5 decades of discovery. She spent evenings there reviewing her notes and planning future experiments. The view from her chambers showed the Valley of the Dark Lords, those massive tombs where the greatest Sith were entombed. She would join them eventually. The thought no longer bothered her as it once had. But not yet. She still had work to do. The question of true immortality haunted her more as the years passed. Her life extension treatments had given her time, but they were not a permanent solution. The underlying mechanism of aging, the gradual breakdown of cellular function, remained beyond her ability to fully arrest. The ancient texts hinted at techniques used by legendary Sith of previous eras, beings who had supposedly lived for centuries or even millennia. But the instructions were fragmentary. often contradictory. Some spoke of transferring one's essence into a new body, living through multiple lives. Others mentioned binding one's spirit to a physical object, achieving a form of existence beyond flesh. She researched every lead, no matter how unlikely, descended into tombs that had not been opened in thousands of years, studied texts written in languages so old that translation was partly guesswork, performed experiments that pushed ethical boundaries she had long ago stopped acknowledging. Nothing produced the breakthrough she sought. The frustration was almost unbearable. She had mastered life. She could shape it, enhance it, even create new forms of it. But she could not make it eternal. Not truly, not permanently. Yet she refused to accept defeat. Somewhere the answer existed. In some forgotten tomb, some undiscovered text, some combination of techniques she had not yet attempted. The key to true immortality was out there. And Sorzus Sin had never failed to find an answer when she truly committed to seeking it. Age came for Sorzus Sin, the way it comes for everyone. Slowly at first, then with increasing insistence. She noticed it in small ways, a stiffness in her joints after long hours in the laboratory, the need for stronger lighting to read the ancient texts, a tiredness that meditation could no longer fully dispel. Her life extension treatments slowed the process considerably, but they could not stop it entirely. For someone who had spent her entire adult life mastering the manipulation of living tissue, the body's betrayal felt personal. She increased her research into immortality techniques, dedicating entire facilities to the pursuit. What had once been a long-term goal became an immediate necessity. Every year that passed was a year closer to the end, and she had far too much left to accomplish. The deepest tombs on Korriban called to her now with urgent intensity. Places she had once catalogued for future exploration became immediate priorities. She led expeditions into chambers that had been sealed for millennia, her students and guards accompanying her into darkness that seemed to resist even force-generated light. One such tomb belonged to a Sith king, whose name had been deliberately erased from all records. The entrance was protected by alchemical traps, so sophisticated that 3 of her guards died before she could disable them. But inside, preserved in conditions that defied explanation, she found what she had been seeking. A complete ritual for essence transfer. The instructions were carved into the walls in ancient Sith hieroglyphs, accompanied by diagrams showing the flow of force energy from one body to another. The technique required a willing or subdued host, extensive preparation, and a level of dark side mastery that few possessed. But it promised genuine immortality, the ability to abandon a dying body and claim a new one, living life after life without end. Sorzus spent months studying those walls. She copied every symbol, analyzed every phrase, consulted with the few scholars who could read the most archaic forms of the Sith language. The technique was theoretically sound. More than that, it showed evidence of having been successfully performed. The king whose tomb this was had lived for over 300 years, according to the fragmentary records she could find. Multiple bodies, one consciousness, a form of immortality that required no technological support, no alchemical treatments, just pure force technique and absolute will. She prepared for her first attempt with meticulous care. The host was a volunteer, a young Sith warrior dying of a wasting disease that even her skills could not cure. He had weeks to live at most, and she offered him a choice: die slowly and painfully, or allow her to use his body as a vessel, ending his suffering while advancing knowledge that could save countless others. He agreed. Perhaps he believed her promises. Perhaps he simply wanted the pain to stop. It did not matter. The ritual took place in her deepest laboratory, a chamber she had prepared according to the tomb's specifications. Channels carved in the floor for directing force energy, crystals placed at specific points to amplify dark side power. the dying warrior strapped to a stone table while Sorzus stood in a circle of her own blood, the final requirement the ancient text demanded. She began the chant, words in a language so old that speaking them made her throat burn. The force responded, swirling between them like a visible current. She could feel her consciousness beginning to separate from her flesh, reaching toward the younger body. For a moment, she touched success. Her awareness expanded into the warrior's dying form, feeling his fading heartbeat, his struggling lungs. She was in both bodies simultaneously. Her mind stretched across the gap between them. Then something went wrong. The warrior's body convulsed. His nervous system, too damaged by disease, could not support the transfer. She felt herself being pulled back, snapping into her original form with a violence that left her gasping on the floor. The warrior was dead. The ritual had failed. Sorzus spent days recovering from that attempt, her body racked with pain from the backlash. But failure only sharpened her determination. She had been closer than she had ever come before. The technique worked in principle. She just needed a healthier host and better preparation. She tried again 2 months later. Then again. Each attempt taught her something new about the process, refined her understanding of the mechanics involved. But each also ended in failure, and the toll on her body grew with every attempt. The dark side was not meant to be used this way, she realized. Or rather, it was, but the price was higher than the ancient texts had revealed. Each failed essence transfer left scars on her spirit that would never fully heal. Her connection to the Force grew stronger, but also more volatile, harder to control. Other Sith Lords began to whisper that she had become unstable, that her obsession with immortality had driven her to madness. Some of it was political posturing, rivals hoping to undermine her influence. But some of it was genuine concern from allies who had watched her transformation over the years. Ajunta Pal summoned her to his throne room after her 5th failed attempt. He was old now too, despite her life extension treatments. His face showed the weight of decades ruling an empire built on ambition and power struggles. "You're killing yourself," he said, without preamble. Sorzus met his gaze without flinching. "I'm trying to save myself. By destroying your body, attempting a technique that clearly doesn't work. It works. The evidence is irrefutable. I simply haven't perfected the execution." He studied her for a long moment. "And when you do, what then? You transfer into a new body and abandon this one. Do that every few decades for eternity. Is that really living, Sorzus? Or just refusing to die?" She had no answer that would satisfy him. How could she explain to someone who had accepted mortality what it felt like to stand on the edge of understanding everything, only to have death waiting to erase it all? Her knowledge could not die with her. It was too valuable, too important. He dismissed her with a warning to be more careful, but they both knew she would not listen, could not listen. The obsession had become fundamental to who she was. Her research expanded in other directions as well. If essence transfer remained elusive, perhaps there were alternative paths to immortality. The ancient texts mentioned Sith who had bound their spirits to objects, becoming something between alive and dead. Others who had achieved a form of Force ghost existence, their consciousness persisting without physical form. She explored them all, attempting to bind her awareness to a specially prepared crystal, researching the techniques that might allow her spirit to linger after death. Each path seemed promising, until she encountered the same fundamental problem. All of these techniques required dying first, and death, she had come to understand through her alchemical work, was not a state from which return was guaranteed. The Force might preserve consciousness, but it might also disperse it into nothingness. The texts were maddeningly vague on what actually happened to the self during and after the transition. Fear crept in then. real fear, not the thrilling uncertainty of experimentation, but the primal terror of oblivion. She who had made others fear her for decades now lay awake nights, afraid of the darkness that awaited everyone. The tombs of Kurubai seemed to mock her. All around her rested the bodies of Sith who had believed themselves immortal through legacy, through power, through the strength of their achievements. But they were still dead, still nothing but dust and fading memories. She pushed herself harder, worked longer hours, took greater risks. Her students worried, but knew better than to intervene. She snapped at assistants over minor mistakes, abandoned promising research that did not directly address her central question: how to live forever, how to truly permanently defeat death itself. The answer had to exist. She had proven too many impossibilities already to believe this final mystery would remain forever sealed. Somewhere in the vast accumulated knowledge of the Sith, in techniques preserved in forgotten tombs or encoded in ancient holocrons, the key existed. But time was running out. She could feel it in her bones, in the increasing effort required for work that had once been effortless. Her enhanced lifespan meant she might have decades remaining, but decades were not enough. Not when immortality itself hung just beyond her reach. The realization came gradually, painfully, like a slow poison working through her system. She might not solve this problem. The woman who had mastered life in all its forms might die before conquering death. The thought was unbearable, yet she had to bear it. 80 years after the exile, Sorzus finally accepted what she had been refusing to acknowledge. She was going to die. Not today, not this year, perhaps not for another 2 or 3 decades if she was fortunate, but eventually, inevitably, her body would fail and her consciousness would end. All the knowledge in her mind, all the discoveries she had yet to make, would be lost. Unless she found another form of immortality. The original Dark Jedi were nearly all gone now. Ajunta Pal had passed 5 years earlier, his death marking the end of an era. Remulus Drypa followed 2 years later. Juzan still lived, ancient and powerful, but even she was fading. The generation that had been exiled from the Republic, that had founded the Sith Empire on Korriban's red sands, was disappearing into history. The new generation of Sith Lords barely remembered the old ways. They had been born into the Empire, raised in a culture that blended Dark Jedi philosophy with Sith mysticism so thoroughly that the seams were invisible. They were Sith in a way the exiles never fully had been, because they knew nothing else. Sorzus watched this transition with mixed feelings: pride that what they had built endured, melancholy that her contemporaries were vanishing, a strange sense of displacement, as though she had outlived her proper time. Her students were masters now, some with students of their own. Her techniques had spread across the Empire, adapted and refined by successive generations. Sith alchemy was no longer her exclusive domain, but a recognized field with multiple schools of thought and practice. She should have felt satisfied. Her influence had shaped an entire civilization. Her discoveries would persist for millennia. By any reasonable measure, she had achieved a form of immortality through her work. But it was not enough. It had never been enough. The shift in her priorities was gradual but absolute. If she could not preserve her consciousness, she would preserve her knowledge so completely that it might as well be her. Every technique, every discovery, every insight gained through 8 decades of obsessive research, documented with such precision that anyone with sufficient skill could reconstruct her work. She began the great compilation that would become her masterpiece and her memorial. The Sith Compendium. It started as a simple organization of her existing notes, thousands of pages accumulated over a lifetime. But as she worked, it became something far more ambitious. Not just a record of techniques, but a comprehensive guide to Sith alchemy in all its forms, theory and practice, philosophy and application, warnings about dangerous methods alongside instructions for their use. She wrote in the ancient Sith language, that archaic tongue she had mastered in Korriban's deepest libraries, partly for security, ensuring only worthy students could access the knowledge, but also because that language had nuances that Basic lacked, concepts that could only be properly expressed in the tongue of beings who had practiced these arts for countless generations before the exiles ever arrived. The work consumed her. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. She barely left her chambers, surrounded by stacks of documents and partially completed manuscripts. Her hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now trembled from age and overuse, but she pushed through the pain. This was her legacy, her bid for a different kind of eternity. Her remaining students visited regularly, concerned by her withdrawal from public life. She dismissed their worries, but accepted their help when they offered to transcribe sections or verify technical details. Some of the younger ones had fresh perspectives that improved her explanations, finding clearer ways to describe processes she had always understood intuitively. The compendium grew. The sections on basic alchemical theory, detailed instructions for enhancement procedures, formulae for creating specific types of creatures, chapters on the relationship between genetics and force sensitivity, warnings about techniques she had attempted and found too dangerous even by Sith standards. She included her failures as well as her successes, the experiments that killed subjects, the procedures that produced unstable results, the theoretical approaches that seemed sound but proved impossible in practice. Future alchemists would learn from her mistakes without having to repeat them. Writing about her failed attempts at essence transfer was particularly difficult, admitting defeat in permanent form, acknowledging that the mystery that had consumed her final decades would remain unsolved. But she owed the truth to whoever might read this work centuries hence. Perhaps they would succeed where she had failed. Her tomb was already prepared. She had designed it years earlier, during a brief period of acceptance that now seemed naive. It stood in the Valley of the Dark Lords, among the monuments to Sith who had shaped their civilization. The location was prestigious, the structure impressive, but she took no comfort from it. Dying Sith Lords traditionally sealed their greatest treasures in their tombs, artifacts they had created or collected, holocrons containing their knowledge and personality, traps to prevent grave robbers from stealing these legacies. Sorzus decided the compendium would rest there with her. Multiple copies, each one painstakingly handwritten and verified for accuracy, protected by alchemical guardians she had specifically created for that purpose, available to those worthy enough to overcome the challenges, hidden from those who would misuse such knowledge. Political power no longer interested her. She resigned from the Dark Council, recommending her most accomplished student as a replacement. The Sith Lords accepted her decision with respect and perhaps relief. She had been a towering figure for so long that her shadow made it difficult for others to fully shine. Freed from political obligations, she focused entirely on the compendium, adding sections, refining language, ensuring clarity without sacrificing depth. The work had to be perfect because it was her final statement to the galaxy. Ezo Xan visited near the end. The last surviving founder of the Sith Empire, besides Sorzus herself. They were ancient now, both of them, bodies failing despite every technique they knew to preserve them. They did not speak much. Words seemed inadequate after 8 decades of shared history. But they sat together in Sorzus' chambers while the sun set over Korriban's endless red wastes, 2 old women who had helped birth an empire and now watched it outgrow them. "Do you regret it?" Zozan asked finally. "Any of it?" Sorzus considered the question. The exile that had seemed like punishment but became liberation. The war against the Republic, the experiments that pushed every ethical boundary, the obsessive pursuit of immortality that had consumed her final decades. "No," she said, "I would do it all again. Every choice. Every discovery, even the failures. Chogzan nodded slowly. Good. Regret is a waste of the time we have left. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and Korriban's stars emerged overhead. Two women who had changed the galaxy, watching the night sky and knowing they would soon join it. When Azanzan left, Sorzus returned to her work. The compendium was nearly complete. Perhaps another year of effort, maybe two, if she wanted it truly perfect. She had that much time. She had to. The compendium was finished on a day when Korriban's twin moons hung visible in the afternoon sky. Sorzus wrote the final sentence, set down her pen, and felt something release inside her chest. Not completion exactly, but acknowledgement. She had done everything within her power. The sum total of her knowledge now existed in physical form, ready to outlast her flesh. 3 copies, each one containing every technique she had mastered. Each word verified, each diagram checked against her original notes. Bound in leather made from creatures she had herself created, pages treated with preservatives that would last millennia in Korriban's dry climate. She held the completed work and marveled at how something so physically modest could represent an entire lifetime. These books were her immortality, not the consciousness-preserving eternity she had sought, but the only form of lasting existence available to her. The tomb waited. She had visited it the previous week, inspecting the preparations one final time. The entrance chamber was impressive if austere, decorated with reliefs showing her greatest achievements. Laboratory equipment turned decorative, alchemical formulas rendered in stone, images of creatures she had designed. Deeper inside, past traps and guardians that would kill the unworthy, a chamber held pedestals for the 3 copies of the compendium. And beyond that, the innermost sanctum where her body would eventually rest. A simple stone sarcophagus, elegant in its minimalism. She had created 6 guardians specifically for the tomb, alchemical constructs that blended elements from apex predators with enhancements that made them nearly unstoppable. They required no food or water, sustained entirely by the dark side energy saturating Korriban. They would stand watch over her legacy for centuries, perhaps millennia, killing anyone who entered without the proper knowledge to pacify them. The traps were equally sophisticated. Pressure plates that triggered collapses, gas chambers filled with toxins, doors that sealed permanently if opened incorrectly. She had designed it all with the same precision she brought to her alchemical work, not cruelty for its own sake, but filtration. Only those truly worthy of the knowledge should gain access to it. Her final students gathered for a last lesson, not a large group, perhaps 20 individuals she considered genuinely accomplished in Sith alchemy. They sat in her primary laboratory while she stood before them, feeling the weight of her years in every movement. The compendium contains everything I have learned, she told them. But knowledge alone is worthless without the wisdom to apply it properly. You must continue the work, push beyond what I achieved, discover what I could not. They listened with the intensity of students receiving a master's final wisdom. Some were hybrid Sith, red-skinned and powerful. Others were pure-blood descendants of the original exiles. All were united by their dedication to understanding life through the lens of the dark side. Do not worship me, she continued. Do not treat my techniques as sacred texts that cannot be improved. I was brilliant, yes, but I was also limited by my era, my resources, my own biases. Future generations will surpass me if they dare to try. She taught them the methods for pacifying her tomb guardians, specific force techniques that would mark them as worthy inheritors. Anyone who possessed the skill to perform these techniques would be capable of understanding the compendium. Anyone who lacked that skill deserved whatever fate the guardians delivered. When I die, she said, meeting each of their eyes in turn, you will seal my body in the tomb, according to the instructions I have provided. The compendium goes with me, let it rest there, waiting for those who prove themselves worthy of its knowledge. One of her students, a woman named Hestina, who showed particular promise, dared to speak. "Why hide it, master? Why not leave copies where we can continue to study directly from your work?" "Because easy access breeds complacency," Sorzus replied. "If the knowledge is freely available, it becomes just another reference text, something to consult but not truly master. But if accessing it requires effort, if students must prove their worth before they can read even a single page, then they will value what they find. They will study it deeply rather than merely skimming for answers." She distributed her laboratory equipment among them, specialized tools she had crafted over decades, alchemical compounds she had refined, specimens representing breakthroughs in her research. Each item was a piece of her legacy, and she wanted them in hands that would use them well. Her personal chambers were dismantled carefully, artifacts catalogued and stored. Her most dangerous creations were either destroyed or placed in stasis for future study. She kept only what would accompany her to the tomb. The physical preparation for death was somehow easier than the emotional reckoning. She spent long hours in meditation, reviewing her life with the same analytical precision she had brought to her research. The Jedi scholar she had been seemed impossibly distant, a different person entirely. The transformation from that idealistic girl to this ancient master of forbidden arts had been absolute. Had she made the right choices, objectively based on her own values and goals? Yes. She had achieved everything she set out to accomplish except immortality, and even that failure had taught her valuable lessons about the limits of flesh and force. But she wondered sometimes about the path not taken. What if she had accepted the Council's judgment and renounced her research? What if she had lived out her life as a conventional Jedi, teaching younglings and meditating on the nature of the light? The thought lasted only moments before she dismissed it. That path would have been a slow death of the mind, constrained and controlled until all curiosity withered. Better to have lived intensely and briefly than dimly and long. Her body was failing more rapidly now. The treatments that had extended her life could not prevent the final decline. Her heart was weakening. Her lungs struggled. Even the Force could only sustain her for so long. She made peace with what was coming. Not acceptance exactly, but acknowledgement without panic. Death was part of the cycle, and she had spent her entire life studying that cycle. To fear it now would be hypocrisy. Zogsan died quietly in her sleep, and Sorzus attended the funeral with a strange sense of finality. The last of her contemporaries was gone. She was the final link to the exile, to the war, to the foundation of everything the Sith had become. Soon she would join them in the tombs, and the next generation would carry the work forward without her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something approaching peace. She had done enough, achieved enough, influenced enough. The Sith Empire would endure for millennia after her death, and her techniques would shape it throughout that time. The compendium would be discovered and rediscovered by successive generations, each one learning from her wisdom and building upon her foundation. That was immortality. Not consciousness preserved, but influence propagated, not life extended, but legacy established. It would have to be enough, because it was all that remained. The end came gently, which surprised her. Sorzus Sin had imagined death as a violent thing, a struggle between will and biology. But when her time finally arrived, it felt more like surrender, a quiet releasing of the grip she had maintained on life for so long. She was in her chambers, surrounded by the few possessions she had chosen to keep. The red light of Korriban's sunset filtered through the windows, painting everything in shades of crimson and gold. Her most accomplished students kept vigil nearby, respecting her wish for solitude while remaining close enough to honor her final moments. Her body had given all it could. The life extension treatments had bought decades, But even they could not prevent the inevitable. Her heart beat slower now, each pulse requiring effort. Her breathing had become shallow, her lungs too tired to draw deep. She felt no pain. Her final alchemical preparation had been a compound that would ease the transition, allowing her mind to remain clear while her body ceased its functions. A small mercy she granted herself after a lifetime of pushing flesh beyond its limits. Through the window she could see the Valley of the Dark Lords in the distance. Her tomb stood among those ancient monuments, waiting to receive her. Everything was prepared. Everything was in order. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the Jedi Temple on Coruscant to this red desert world, from scholar to warrior to alchemist to legend. Every choice had led inevitably to this moment, and she found she regretted none of it. The Force surrounded her, dark and familiar, like an old friend come to guide her home. She could feel the pull of it, inviting her to let go, to release her hold on physical existence and dissolve into that vast energy that connected all things. For someone who had spent her life trying to avoid this moment, there was strange comfort in its arrival. Her students felt the disturbance when her spirit finally separated from flesh. The dark side rippled across Korriban like a wave, touching every Force-sensitive being on the planet. In temples and academies across the Sith Empire, practitioners paused mid-meditation as they felt the passing of one of their greatest masters. Hestina entered the chamber first, her eyes red but her composure maintained. She knelt beside the body that had housed such brilliance and gently closed the eyes that would see no more. "May your knowledge endure," she whispered. "May your legacy never fade." The funeral rites lasted 3 days. Sith lords from across the Empire traveled to Korriban to pay respects. Some came out of genuine admiration for her achievements. Others came because tradition demanded it. All came because Sorzus sin had been foundational to everything their civilization had become. Her body was prepared according to her specifications, wrapped in cloth, treated with preservatives, adorned with symbols representing her greatest discoveries. The 3 copies of the compendium were placed around her, their leather bindings dark against the pale fabric. The procession to her tomb moved slowly through the Valley of the Dark Lords. Thousands lined the route, watching as the woman who had helped birth their empire made her final journey. The current Dark Lord led the ceremony, speaking words about legacy and the eternal nature of knowledge. Inside the tomb, past the guardians that stood motionless for now, her sarcophagus waited. They laid her body within it, the compendium arranged on pedestals around the chamber. Alchemical seals were activated, preserving everything within against the ravages of time. As the final stone was set and the entrance sealed, the guardians awakened. They would stand watch now, eternal and patient, waiting for those worthy enough to claim the knowledge within. The Sith Empire mourned for the customary period, then returned to the business of existence. New students filled the academies. New discoveries built upon old foundations. The work continued, as Sorzus had always intended it should. But her influence did not fade with her death. It grew. Within a generation, the compendium had become legendary. Stories spread about the dangerous knowledge sealed within her tomb. Young Sith lords dared each other to attempt the guardians, though few survived the encounter. Those who did return spoke of chambers filled with secrets that could reshape the galaxy. A century after her death, a promising student named Dathka managed to pacify the guardians and access the compendium. He spent months inside the tomb, copying sections before the guardian's patience expired, and drove him out. The fragments he brought back revolutionized Sith alchemy, introducing techniques that had been lost when Sorzus died. 5 centuries later, during the height of the old Sith Empire, her tomb had become a pilgrimage site. Ambitious alchemists made the journey to Korriban specifically to test themselves against her guardians. The greatest among them gained access to portions of the compendium, each discovery fueling new advances in their dark art. When the old Sith Empire eventually fell, scattered by Republic forces and Jedi crusades, Korriban was abandoned. The tombs were left to the desert wind and the passage of ages, but Sorzus' guardians remained, sustained by the planet's deep dark side presence, protecting knowledge that predated the fall. Millennia passed. The Sith themselves evolved. Changing from the red-skinned species, the exiles had conquered into something new. The philosophies Sorzus had helped develop were refined into the formal Sith code. Her techniques became foundational to Sith training, though few who practiced them knew her name. Darth Bane, architect of the Rule of Two, discovered fragments of the compendium during his pilgrimage to Korriban. The alchemical knowledge he gained there influenced his understanding of how to preserve Sith teachings through successive generations. He took what Sorzus had written about creating legacies and applied it to his restructuring of the entire Sith Order. Darth Plagueis, obsessed with defeating death through manipulation of midi-chlorians, sought out every reference to Sorzus Sin's work he could find. Her failed attempts at essence transfer taught him what not to attempt. Her successful life extension techniques informed his own experiments. Even Darth Sidious, Emperor of the Galaxy, utilized principles first documented in the compendium. The cloning technologies he employed to preserve himself drew upon alchemical foundations Sorzus had established 6,000 years before his birth. Her influence rippled through galactic history in ways she could never have imagined. Every Sith who practiced alchemy stood upon foundations she had laid. Every dark side user who sought to reshape life followed paths she had first mapped. The tomb itself became a place of power in the Force. Her presence lingered there, not as a conscious ghost but as an imprint, an echo of brilliance and ambition that touched anyone who entered. Some felt inspiration, others felt dread, all felt the weight of knowledge accumulated and preserved. Korriban's red sands shifted over the centuries, sometimes covering the tombs, sometimes revealing them anew. The planet breathed with the slow rhythm of geological time, indifferent to the civilizations that rose and fell upon its surface. But the Valley of the Dark Lords endured, and with it the legacy of those buried within. Sorzus Sin had sought immortality, and believed she failed. But 6,000 years after her death, students still studied her techniques. Scholars still analyzed her writings. Her name was spoken with reverence by those who understood what she had achieved. She had wanted to preserve her consciousness. Instead, she preserved something more fundamental: her understanding, her methodology, her relentless pursuit of knowledge regardless of cost. That was the true immortality. Not life without end, but influence without expiration. Somewhere in the cosmos, stars wheeled through their ancient dance. Planets circled suns that would burn for billions of years more. The Force flowed through all things, dark and light, life and death, in an eternal cycle that predated civilization and would outlast it. On Korriban, dust settled slowly over red stone. The tombs stood silent beneath alien stars. Inside one of them, surrounded by her life's work, Sorzus Sin rested. Her body had returned to the elements that formed it. Her consciousness had dispersed into the Force, but her knowledge remained, waiting patiently in the darkness for worthy hands to claim it. All seekers of knowledge eventually rest. All ambition finds its end. The brilliant and the ordinary, the powerful and the weak, all return to the same dust beneath the same stars. But what they discover along the way, what they create and preserve and pass forward, that endures, that becomes immortal in ways mere flesh never could. The red sands remember. Even as they forget, the ancient tombs hold secrets that sleep through ages, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to wake them. And the Force flows on, carrying whispers of those who shaped it, who bent it to their will, who refuse to accept the limits others placed upon them. May you find the rest that even the greatest must eventually seek. May your own pursuits lead to knowledge worth preserving, and may you dream of red deserts beneath alien stars, where mysteries sleep eternal in the patient dark. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey into the life of Sorzus, consider subscribing for more forgotten tales from Star Wars legends. There are thousands of years of history yet to explore, countless stories waiting to be told. Sleep well. The galaxy and its ancient secrets will still be here when you wake.